No one thought this was possible. Artillery isn't designed to hit what the US just used it to strike. But America did it. An Iranian submarine is done. And it's not because of depth charges or torpedoes. It's because the US pulled off the impossible by using missiles designed to take out stationary targets on the ground to destroy a naval asset that is supposed to be so hidden that it's almost impossible to hit using weapons designed for the purpose. This was the impossible shot. And now an Iranian submarine that thought it was safe is plumbing the depths in a way that it was never supposed to. That's according to the War Zone, or TWZ, which says that the US has been using the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, to launch short-range ballistic missiles at Iran's naval assets. Several ships have already gone down to America's creative use of a missile that isn't made for taking out warships. But the headline strike is the one that was never supposed to happen. A missile that can't hit moving targets has taken out an Iranian submarine. We'll explain what the US hit and why it matters later, but before we do, we have to answer the question that immediately comes to mind: how? After all, the ATACMS was never intended to do what it's just done. It's an impressive missile for sure, capable of carrying a blast fragmentation warhead weighing up to 500 pounds, and with a maximum range of 300 kilometers or 186 miles, ATACMS is a ballistic missile that strikes fast and hits hard. It can be fired from both the HIMARS and the Multiple Launch Rocket System M270 artillery platforms, and as Missile Threat points out, it's a road mobile missile due to these platforms. Not that the US would have taken advantage of this mobility in any serious fashion, especially as it doesn't have boots on the ground in Iran. The odds are that the submarine killing ATACMS was fired from a US base on friendly territory near Iran. The US has bases in Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, all of which line the Persian Gulf and can likely strike as deep as the Iranian west coast. Mobility is less of a factor when the US has so many options to strike, but there's one thing that should have held the ATACMS back from destroying a submarine. Lockheed Martin explains. The Army Tactical Missile System, ATACMS, is a conventional surface-to-surface artillery weapon system capable of striking targets well beyond the range of existing Army cannons, rockets, and other missiles, the ATACMS manufacturer says. Surface-to-surface, not surface-to-sea. ATACMS is about as far from an anti-ship or anti-submarine missile as you can get, yet the US has found a way to turn its powerful short-range ballistic missile into a naval asset neutralizer. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the US Air Force, General Dan Kane, made that very clear during a press conference at the Pentagon, where he discussed how the US has been using its artillery to do the impossible. In just the first 13 days of this operation, our artillery forces have made history. They fired the first precision strike missiles ever used in combat, reaching deep into enemy territory, Kane proclaimed before adding, "They have used Army ATACMS to sink multiple ships, including a submarine. And they've done all of this with the precision and determination that comes from relentless training and trust in each other and in their weapon systems." That's confirmation that comes squarely from the horse's mouth. The only thing that Kane didn't tell us is what type of submarine the US destroyed using ATACMS. We have some ideas about that, which we'll cover soon, but what we're now seeing from the US is that it has such superiority over Iran's navy that it's able to use almost any weapon it chooses to destroy submarines and warships that it knows can't compete with the force that it's brought to the Middle East. Iran's navy is already shattered. Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty reports that the US military claimed on March 11th that it has already sunk about 60 of Iran's vessels. Among them are a pair of Moj-class frigates. Plus, the US has been hitting Iran's fast boats, which it uses to assault merchant ships in the Strait of Hormuz, to the point where hundreds of those smaller ships have been taken out of the equation. What we're seeing here is the complete destruction of Iran as a naval force. The US has effectively destroyed Iran's ability to generate any sort of combat power via its navy by using a 4-phase campaign to eliminate Iran's waterborne threats. First came the amassing of American naval power, which included the deployment of multiple ships, including aircraft carriers, to the waters around Iran in the 60 days leading up to Operation Epic Fury. That phase also saw the US get its logistics in place, along with its information services that allowed it to gather intelligence on its Iranian targets. The next phase involved strikes against Iran's air defenses, air force, and navy, the latter of which focused on ships that Iran might have used to immediately retaliate to the firestorm that the US unleashed during the opening days of the operation. Follow-on strikes made up the next phase as the US took out piers, ports, and munition stores, which deprived what was left of Iran's navy of launching points, safe harbor, and restocking capabilities. Finally, the sustained strikes came, including the US taking out stranded Iranian naval assets as and when it saw fit. Iran's submarine fell at some point during the third or fourth phase. The result is what we see now. The US Navy is dominating the waters around Iran everywhere but in the Strait of Hormuz. And its dominance is so clear that it can attempt and pull off what should be impossible shots against submarines that were never the intended targets of a ballistic missile designed to hit things on the ground. We'll return to why this was such an impossible shot in a few minutes. The question of what submarine specifically the US hit remains unanswered, and Kane hasn't shed any light. We mostly know what Iran has on the submarine front. The Nuclear Threat Initiative said back in September 2025 that the Islamic Republic of Iran Navy commands a submarine force of up to 30 vessels. That seems impressive at first glance, though it becomes decidedly less so when you realize that 24 of these vessels are actually mini-submarines. Still very dangerous weapons in the right hands, but not the full-blown submarines that can become major threats to the US Navy. Of the 6 or so others, all are diesel-electric submarines, which are a step below the more modern, nuclear-powered attack submarines that we see the likes of the US using. Of the larger submarines, 3 are Tarik-class vessels, which are actually just repurposed Russian Kilo-class subs that can travel at speeds of 17 knots when submerged and have 533mm tubes for torpedoes, along with mine-laying capabilities. The other 3 are Fatih-class submarines, which were commissioned in February 2019 and April 2023, have a top speed of between 14 and 23 knots, and have similar weapons capabilities to the Tarik class. Iran has also been supposedly building the Besat class of submarines, which are supposedly equipped with surface-to-air missiles. However, those haven't seen the light of day or the depths of the ocean yet, so we can exclude them from the list of what the US has struck. Still, this is a submarine fleet to be respected. Not necessarily feared, at least when compared to other nations that have large fleets, but respected. Iran has also been working on all of its submarines with the intention of equipping them with air-independent propulsion systems, which would have increased their underwater durability to the point where they became even greater dangers in the Persian Gulf. So the US had to tackle the subs, and we'll explain why soon. But the question still remains, which of these types of submarines did the US take out with its ATACMS? We'll answer that question in a second, but before we do, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. And now is the perfect time to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Now, there are 2 candidates for what the US struck with its surface-to-surface ballistic missiles. First up is a Ghadir-class submarine, which is one of the mini-submarines that make up the majority of Iran's underwater fleet. Equipped with 2 533mm torpedo tubes, these submarines can be dangerous, and we know that at least one of them has been destroyed by the US. However, we can immediately take it out of the running. TWZ reports that US Central Command, or CENTCOM, has indeed publicized the striking of what appears to be a Ghadir-class mini-sub. However, that strike was carried out using AGM-114 Hellfire missiles while the submarine was in port, and not the ATACMS that struck the sub that we're looking for. Instead, we get a clue from a March 5th video address by the head of CENTCOM, Admiral Brad Cooper. According to Cooper, the most operational Iranian submarine now has a hole in its side. Note that Cooper didn't say mini-submarine, so we know that this was either a Fatih or Tarik-class submarine, and the odds are that Cooper is referring to the latter. How do we know? Well, satellite images published by Planet Labs show that one of Iran's 3 Tarik-class submarines appeared to be sunk at the Bandar Abbas naval base on March 4th. Images from March 2nd showed that the submarine was untouched just a couple of days before, even in the aftermath of the initial strikes conducted as part of the operation. But 2 days later, it sank, and a day after that, Cooper was claiming that the US had struck Iran's most operational submarine so hard that it now has a hole in its side. Follow the breadcrumbs and they seem to lead to the conclusion that the submarine that the US hit was a Tarik-class vessel stationed in a port that serves as Iran's main naval base and provides direct access to the Strait of Hormuz. So we have an idea of what the US hit with its ATACMS. Frankly, it makes plenty of sense that it was a full-sized submarine that the US struck with its surface-to-surface ballistic missiles, rather than a much smaller and mobile mini-sub. But we still haven't covered how the US pulled off this impossible shot. Again, remember that submarines are supposed to be difficult to hit, even by the weapons that are designed to strike them. An underwater sub is all but invisible from the surface, especially to the satellites that the US would use ahead of an ATACMS strike. Granted, Iran's submarines all run on diesel, which makes them louder than nuclear-powered subs and easier to detect on sonars. But those sonars have to be on ships or submarines, and vessels that are hunting for submarines tend to have the torpedoes and underwater missiles that would have made it so that the US didn't need to unleash ATACMS against Iran's submarine. So what happened? Some viewers may have already put the pieces together. If it was indeed the Tarik-class submarine at Bandar Abbas that the US hit using ATACMS, it was able to pull off this impossible strike because Iran's regime was dumb enough to leave its submarine docked at port that was in range of America's artillery. That port can definitely be hit from US bases in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, yet Iran's navy left one of its few operational full-size submarines. Call it overconfidence, call it stupidity, but whatever you call it, this is a massive strategic blunder by Iran that signals to the US just how effectively Operation Epic Fury has crippled Iran's military leadership, along with the command and control centers that should have been giving the orders to get the now stricken sub out of Bandar Abbas. Iran presented the US with the sort of stationary target that ATACMS is designed to hit. The US said, "Thank you very much," and it launched its missile at a naval asset that should never have been vulnerable to ATACMS in the first place. This was a submarine, a vessel that is made to stay hidden underwater, and Iran left it on clear display in a port that the US could reach with so many of its weapons. Even without military bases in other countries being in play, Iran must have still been aware that American air superiority is such that it could have sent a fighter jet or bomber to attack Bandar Abbas. The US had so many options for this strike, so it chose the most audacious one available just to pull off a kill that should have been impossible. Well done, Iran's regime. This is true strategic incompetence. We may have just made it sound like the US took out Iran's submarine just because it could. That isn't the case. Submarines are and should be viable targets for the US because it has a lot to gain from causing Iran to lose its underwater threat, beyond the humiliation being experienced by the country's crumbling regime for enabling this strike to happen in the first place. Reason number one is simple. The US took out a vessel that is capable of laying mines. We told you earlier that Tarik-class submarines can lay mines, and that's something that Iran has been threatening to do in the Strait of Hormuz for much of Operation Epic Fury. The US has been doing everything that it can to prevent this possibility. By March 11th, Canada's CBC was reporting that the US had already claimed to have eliminated 16 of Iran's mine-laying vessels a day before, which is a clear sign that the US needs to keep the Strait of Hormuz clear of these very dangerous underwater weapons. And it makes sense. Iran has been threatening to make that waterway, through which 20% of the world's seaborne oil sails, so impassable that it will lead to oil prices rising to $200 per barrel. At least 17 merchant ships have already been hit in the Strait of Hormuz, per the New York Times. So adding mines into the equation will be a major problem on the global economic scale. Having those mines being laid by a submarine that could go undetected while sailing through the strait would be an even bigger problem. So the destruction of the Tarik-class sub at Bandar Abbas serves a very practical purpose when cast into that particular light. Speaking of merchant ships, the destruction of Iranian submarines, and we can count the mini-sub that the US took out, also means that these vessels can't present a direct threat to ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Merchant ships aren't equipped with the sort of equipment needed to detect submarines lurking beneath them. Beyond the mine threat, Iran's submarines carry torpedoes that could be rattled off at the ships trying to sail through the strait that Iran is attempting to blockade. We can't say that this would be beyond Iran's capabilities. It's already proven itself willing to launch direct attacks on these ships, and it's announced several times that passage through the strait is closed. A handful of ships have been allowed through, with Al Jazeera reporting that they are being operated by the likes of China, Pakistan, and India. For most of the world, the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and Iran's submarines have the weapons needed to strike so much fear into the hearts of merchant ship captains that they wouldn't risk a crossing, even with escorts from warships or aerial assets. So the US is taking a clear threat out of the equation. If Iran's most operational submarine has a hole in its side, then it can't do anything to hurt merchant vessels. It also can't do anything to hurt America's warships. Don't forget that the US has several aircraft carriers along with other warships in the Persian Gulf region. The national interest has already theorized that Iran's Ghadir-class submarines could sneak up on an aircraft carrier and launch attacks using torpedoes or anti-ship missiles. Forbes tempers that claim in a February 27th article where it says that Iran doesn't have the firepower to sink an American supercarrier. But one of its subs could certainly do damage, and the propaganda victory that would result from this damage would put a dent in the US claims that it has practically destroyed Iran's navy. The Strait of Hormuz is certainly the priority when tackling Iran's submarine force. But protecting warships that are key to America's ability to sustain attacks against the Iranian mainland is a nice little bonus. And finally, consider what happens if Iran attempts to repair its damaged submarines. Those repairs would require it to station a damaged sub in a base that is large enough to accommodate the vessel and has the facilities needed to carry out those repairs. But even basic submarine maintenance costs a lot of money, so repairing a sub that is so heavily damaged that it has a hole in its side may not be a priority for a regime that is dealing with a firestorm all over its territory. Oh, and repairing a submarine just creates the same problem that led Iran to this mess in the first place. That sub has to be at a standstill in a naval base somewhere, so it also can't be submerged if repairs are going to be carried out. Once again, the US would be able to pick and choose how to strike against a stationary target, meaning we could end up seeing more impossible shots if Iran attempts to make repairs. And do you know what will really stick in the Iranian regime's craw? As its submarines are sinking due to the US pulling off kill shots using weapons that aren't supposed to hit subs, the US and its submarines are showing Iran how it should be done. On March 4th, US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth confirmed that an American submarine had sunk an Iranian warship somewhere in the Indian Ocean. That ship, which Hegseth claimed died a quiet death, was later confirmed to be the Iris Dana. At least 84 of the warship's crew died in the American submarine attack, depriving Iran's navy of skilled personnel, along with yet another of its ships. If that isn't the perfect display of the disparity between the US and Iran in Operation Epic Fury, we don't know what is. American submarines sailing thousands of miles away from home are destroying Iran's warships, but Iran's submarines can't even get out of port before being taken out with impossible shots by weapons that were never designed for killing vessels. This is US dominance, and it's been the story of the war ever since Operation Epic Fury was launched. We've covered how the US tackled what should be an undersea threat in this video, but the US has also gone from hitting undersea threats to taking out underground bunkers. It appears that attempting to hide on land isn't working out for Iran either, and you can learn why by watching our video on how American B-2 bombers took out Iran's biggest underground secret. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you're subscribed to the Military Show to catch all of our coverage of Operation Epic Fury. And thank you as always for watching.